I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. What's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here at Black Power Media. Again, I'm Jared Ball. Very happy to be your host. Big shout out to my main man, Dr. Hate, for putting me on to a movie I had never heard of, never seen, but did watch and wanted to do a quick video about. If for no other reason, to reiterate the point about the Vernon philosophy of Black media avoidance. That is the general idea that no oppressed community should look to see itself or find itself in the imposed commercial mainstream media that is delivered. And especially when we like it, we should be more critical. Uh, so I got put on by Dr. Hate to this film. It's called Tamango, and it's from 1958. It stars the legendary Dorothy Dandridge and is about a rebellion of enslaved Africans on a Dutch slave ship. And I'm not going to spoil the film because I would like for folks to see it to check at least some of what I do want to share. And then maybe we can come back and do parts 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. But the main point I wanted to make is that the film made in 1958. Again, since then we've seen any number of films about enslavement, about African people, and we've, of course, more recently seen many more. But what I would like to suggest is that very little has changed in terms of the content or the delivery. In fact, maybe things have gotten worse. The idea would have been, I think, easy it would be easy to assume that in the time since 1958, things would have gotten better in terms of symbolism and depiction and character arcs and content and all of this kind of thing. But I think this film is testimony to the fact that things are not getting better, have not advanced, and have, if anything, have only become more sophisticated. So what do I mean by that? Again, without spoiling, what you see in Tamango are many of the themes that we still get in films about slavery or enslavement. We get some issues around complexion, some issues around identity. We get some issues around treachery, on whose team does one belong. And what I like about this one also, admittedly, is that it delves a little bit into issues of interracial relationships, biracial and multiraciality, and raises some, I think, interesting questions and ideas and challenges to some conventional ideas and notions of those histories and experiences, particularly how they're depicted in film. And then I would just quickly say, we mentioned it not long ago, in comparison to films like, for instance, Sankofa, where that topic is touched upon at least a little bit. I don't think that there's any sign that there was a real advance from a mainstream Hollywood film to a nominally African-centered Black radical film. I don't know that there was that much of a change or an advance. Certainly, as it compares to other mainstream commercial films, I would argue there's been zero advance. In fact, maybe a regression in terms of content, topic, addressing the topic, and so on and so forth. In fact, starting with the fact that the whole film centers on rebellion. Again, no spoiler. It's just a simple fact, easily observable in terms of the promotion for the film, et cetera, and so forth. So just a couple of quick for instances. You get, of course, the beautiful Dorothy Dandridge. You get the stereotypes of some of the ways in which white men sought to engage enslaved African women and those of different complexions and backgrounds. You get the interaction of again, issues of complexion, roles of women, solidarity, multi or biraciality, all I think dealt with just as well as anywhere else we would have seen. Challenges to, from who is authentic, who is real. I mean, I think very real conflicts are depicted here in ways that we don't see or certainly no worse than we would have seen in any of the more recent films, whether it's Emancipation, whether it's Django, whether it's 12 Years a Slave, whether it's Harriet, whether it's, I mean, all of these more recent films that have touched on this subject, none have done, I think, any better or demonstrated any break from, if anything, the differences are obviously in technology, the the look, the sound, the quality of the film, uh in terms of the not the movie itself, but the technology of digital film versus the analog that they were working with before, CGI, whatever else. All of that is better today, obviously. But the storytelling, I would argue, is no better. The political content, I would argue, is no better. And the acting is certainly no better. There was a lot of fine acting in this film. It makes you wonder what happened to so many of these talented Black actors, because I think only Dorothy is had any major career of those who were involved. But then again, I don't, I'm no expert on that. We would have to. So anyway, just wanted to show a couple of quick, some shots of what the film looked like, just to give an idea. But it's again, or I would say that is the only area of difference. That is in terms of the aesthetics as opposed to the content, and that I think is actually sort of what I think is kind of an interesting point about all of this. All right, another thing I wanted to bring up in this, in terms of making the comparison, is that, again, just going back to some of the work I've been focused on lately, and bringing back up again this National Bureau of Economic Research report that we've been talking a lot about lately, and the lack of material change that I would argue matches the lack of substance or content change or advance that I'm making, I'm arguing about in terms of the film. So in other words, when we look at the film Tamango, you get, as I said, a lot of the same storylines and themes that we still get to this day, with a little bit more of a focus on the rebellious side of the issue and the history. Again, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that the entire film takes place on the ship. So it's a fascinating way to deal with, to approach the scope of an entire film, not leaving the ship and dealing exclusively with this issue of the rebellion of enslaved Africans. And then, some of the nuanced difference, inner workings of all of that I think we haven't seen. Maybe we haven't even seen that since in film. So I would, again, I don't want to spoil it while encouraging people to check it out, and then to see if you think what I'm saying makes sense. But then, as I'm saying here, there has been no material advance since 1958 when the film was produced. So again, part of what I continue to argue is that there's a parallel between dominant media, symbolism, propaganda, et cetera, psychological warfare, and so forth, and the maintenance of a consistently material inequality, or the colonial experience. So as I'm showing here from that report, the median wealth gap starts at very high levels in 1950. And what they're showing is that they're saying, since enslavement, once again, the report's point is, since enslavement, there has been no, since enslavement, the wealth gap, the wealth ratio between white and Black has only collapsed down to where we are today, to 6-1. And we can't expect it to get any better than that. That's the best we can expect it to get, given the unequal starting point. Okay. And they talk a little bit about how immediately after enslavement, there was an immediate drop or closing of that gap, as it would be expected, because people went from basically having nothing to having something. And even that something represents a big jump. So, but as it says here, the median wealth gap starts at very high levels in the 1950s, converges dramatically between 1950 and 1970, and then stalls after 1980. So what they're saying here is, up until 1950, between 1860 and 1950, there was this movement, again, relative to a starting point of slavery and nothing, of a massive closing of the gap of wealth, getting it, from, they track, and, I'll put the link again. People can on your own get the details, but it goes from like 100 to 1 to 20 to 1 to blah 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 blah. But then, and then from 1950 to 1970, there's a closing of that gap, and that makes sense. Post World War II, a rise of a black middle class that is, as I talk about in the myth and propaganda of black buying power a little bit, is encouraged to project to the world that now that the US is the singular hegemon, it's formerly enslaved, could even be seen as doing well in American-led capitalism. So this was encouraged. And of course, the black bourgeoisie takes advantage of this as well. But then, of course, after Nixon, the Nixon administration, the increased assault on black power movement, and then the installation by the early 1980s of Ronald Reagan, all of those gains are locked out, squashed, and limited. So that's why we say why it continues today. The median wealth gap remains 10 to 1, equivalent to the typical black household, equivalent to the typical black household holding just 10 cents of every dollar the typical white household holds. So again, my point is simply to say that since Tamango comes out in 1958 and where we are in 2023, materially, there's been no real advance between black and white. Meanwhile, there's been at best a consistency, and I would argue really a devolution of the quality and the content of films dealing with the topic of enslavement since Tamango. Now, that's not to say that every film in that era was better, and it's been, you know, a straight line down, and that there's been nothing positive done in film since on this issue. But what I'm just simply saying is there's not been much of a change, not one that would be expected with the mythology associated with an advance in black liberation and material condition. Again, none of which exists and none of which is supported by data. Just one other quick section from that same report, just to make, you know, to further make the point. While housing wealth has appreciated since 1950, stock equity has appreciated by 5 times as much. These large price increases in equity markets have led to disproportionate capital gains for the wealthiest Americans. So just another quick example of that lack of advance, or how the myth in a sort of nuanced way is told and confusingly. So for instance, we'll hear all the time how black people have increased their ownership of homes, obviously since 1950. But what they don't say is reported here that the value of that has not kept up at all with the value of stock, which is owned increasingly by a smaller amount of wealthy people, almost exclusively white. So as I talk about all the time here, there's no, and in the book as well, there is no stock to buy. There is no land to buy. It's all bought up. It's all owned already by a handful and increasingly shrinking number of people, and therefore mostly white. So therefore, this idea that black people should catch up that way doesn't make any sense either. But anyway, so again, from Tamango, the era in which Tamango was produced in the 1950s to today, there's been no material advance of note, no meaningful material advance, no meaningful change in inequality, or material improvement for black people and many others. And yet the films, the symbolism, maybe with an increase or a prevalence, a greater prevalence of black inclusion, has not been commensurate with an increase in black power, material or otherwise. So just to wrap up this quick little video, since 1958 and the release of Tamango, we've gotten a bunch of movies on the history of black people, a bunch. We've gotten a number of films that focus on the history of enslavement and the black experience in this country, but none that I would argue have made a stark advance in terms of content. And I would argue most have been a regressive step, have been a devolution from this film. And again, I'm not holding it up as some, I'm just saying, relatively speaking. So for instance, again, without spoiler, we get a lot of the same sort of themes. We get some, you know, that we've seen in films, you know, some Roots and wherever else. You get the, you know, the horrible whites, the slightly less horrible whites, the whites we're supposed to feel some sort of sympathy for. We get reference to Africans selling Africans. So we get a little bit, you know, that same thing. We get a little bit of that in there as well. I think you get a much more nuanced look at a mulatta experience, so-called, which I think is in many ways helpful to the history and maybe not to the accurate, the real histories of that experience. But again, relative to films to this day, I don't think has been any step back. Was no step back. That film, Tamango, that is, was certainly no step back, and is probably an advance. And then ultimately, and then I will say this. I don't think it's a spoiler to say this. I think it's fair. I think it's only fair to say that the white body count in this film surpasses any modern film on the issue. So that alone puts Tamango, gives Tamango a head start on these films by comparison. But ultimately, what I'm saying is, while we get maybe more today, they look better today. There's more sophisticated in delivery today, technologically, etc. More beautiful Black people on screen today than ever. What Teray said, 50 years ago is still more correct than ever. That Black visibility is not Black power, and the material conditions are not matching. Even the nominal advances people claim have taken place in the content of film since the 50s. Certainly relative to Tamango, there's been no advance either in the content or in the lived or real experiences of the film. Now, that said, just very quickly, Dorothy Dandridge is herself a very interesting person. Her life deserves much more attention than I'm giving it here. She actually fought in the filmmakers of this film, for instance, to desexualize her character, to give a more accurate and honest and prideful performance or version of this character. So I, certainly can appreciate all of that. And despite all the other contradictions of her personal and professional life, but that's for other experts to deal with and to assess, you yourselves to assess. I was just mostly interested in this lack of difference in terms of the material condition and in terms of the content and quality of the film, and in fact arguing that in each case it's probably been a devolution, despite most of the propaganda and mythology that argues something else. So anyway, thanks again to Dr. Haight for putting me onto the film. I now want to encourage you all to see it, and let's continue the conversation here at I Mix What I Like and throughout the BPM platform. As Fred Hampton used to say, to you we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace. Thanks again, everybody. Catch you in that whirlwind.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like.